We are digging into Judges, the book of Judges, and I'll be honest, I remember going through Judges years ago in like Sunday school, and probably have heard a sermon series through Judges, but going through it, trying to pull from it the lessons that it's actually teaching is really interesting because it's a collection of stories from a certain time period. And a lot of times there's these lessons that kind of just jump out. It's like, oh, that's kind of a funny thing to throw in there. And some of the texts that we're going to look at today, there's kind of some questions on that, like, wonder why this was included along with these other stories. Because anytime we tell a story, we choose what we're going to tell, right? I mean, we leave out certain things, we include other things, and so Judges is a set of stories, but it's not all the stories from that time period for sure. And so each of these stories are in for a particular reason. So what we talked about last week, we went through chapter 1, chapter 2, and then a little bit of chapter 3. Now what we're going to do today is we're going to jump around a little bit, but we're mostly going to spend our time in chapter 3. And so we're going to look at a little bit from chapter 1 because it kind of sets up something that we're going to see in chapter 3. So just as a reminder, we're in the period of time that is after the exile. After the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, so they've left Egypt, they've come into the land, and in the book of Joshua, what we have there is the conquest of the land for the most part. But what we find out in the beginning of the book of Judges is the people of Israel did not completely obey what God asked them to do, which was to move the people out that were already there, to get rid of them completely. And in most cases, the children of Israel kind of let them stay. And they lived among them, and they assimilated with them. They married their sons and their daughters to those that were already in the land because it was so much more convenient. You can imagine how difficult it would be to drive out other tribes from the promised land. So that's the era of time that we're in. This is a time before there are kings. So there are no kings in the land at this time. It is just sort of tribal. It's regional, and it's a really interesting sort of political situation. So let's jump right into the story that we're going to look at today. And I'm calling this today, How Long Must We Suffer? And the reason why I'm calling it that is because you're going to see kind of this continual cycle of suffering. It kind of continues over time, and something must happen to stop the suffering. So we're going to kind of explore that today. Let's take a look at what Judges says in chapter 1, verse 9. It says, after that, Judah, now Judah is a tribe at this point. Judah was a person, but by this point it's a tribe that descend from Judah. Okay, so after that, Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country, the Negev and the western foothills. And Caleb said, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. Wonderful names in this, by the way. I wish I spoke Hebrew. It would be really fun. This is Caleb. Okay, so let's just talk. Who is Caleb? Do you remember Caleb? Caleb shows up in the stories before Judges. Caleb was a very influential person. He was a contemporary of Joshua. He was one of those very important leaders of Israel, and he's kind of the last of his kind, so to speak. He lived through the desert wanderings. He actually was part of the conquest when they came into the land, and he's kind of the last one left from the Moses era. Okay, so he is a very important character. And so he chooses to do something that's going to set up the children of Israel for a really important task in the future. And when we read it here, it's kind of one of those questions of, why is this story included? I mean, what is it about what Caleb's doing that is going to invest in the next generation? I think that's what we need to be asking. So let's just kind of think through this. Caleb said, at this point, Caleb's an important character. People know who Caleb is. Caleb said, I will give my daughter Achsah. Okay, so in those days, usually the father would figure out who the daughter is going to marry. Those of you young ladies in here, I probably couldn't imagine your dad picking out your husband. In fact, maybe that would be really frightening. But for whatever reason, Caleb says, I'm going to pick out my daughter's husband, and it's going to be the one who, what does he do? The one who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. And so what he's basically saying is, I want to marry my daughter to a leader. And he needs to be a military leader. But the concept holds. I mean, in any generation, a dad might do well to think about these kind of things. I want to marry my daughter to a leader, someone who obeys God. Because you remember what we talked about last week? God had told the children of Israel to drive out the tribes that were already there, to get them out of the land. And so, in a sense, what Caleb's saying is, I want to marry my daughter to the man who's willing to obey God even when it's hard. Even when it's difficult to do what God has commanded. That's the kind of man I want my daughter to marry. Now, I think this goes much beyond just a dad thinking about the life of his daughter, and I think you'll see what I mean by this. Now, here's one of the things that we kind of have to wrestle with. I think this is kind of how we connect it to us. Sometimes we think we'll suffer if we obey God, right? I mean, there's certain things that God wants us to do, and if we do them, we're going to suffer. If we obey God in certain areas of our life, there's going to be difficulty that comes along with that. And you can imagine in this era, in the time of the judges, that was true then too, and probably to a greater extent. You see, God had told them to do something. And it would be easy for them to get into the mindset of saying, you know what God told us to do is just about unthinkable. It's really difficult, and if we do it, we're going to suffer. It's going to be hard. It's going to be painful, and it'd be way easier just to not do what he said, just to ignore it. And by the way, I've got 2 young kids, and I've seen children ignore their parents quite often in my own home, so I know it's a tactic that we do. We probably all did it when we were young. No doubt the children of Israel found it much easier to ignore God, but you know what? God does not like being ignored. And he had a system, a method for making sure that those children of Israel did not ignore him forever. And that's what we're going to see as we go along. So notice what this says. This is Caleb. He says, and they, and gave their daughters, I'm sorry, this is not Caleb. This is the children of Israel. I got it backwards. This is the children of Israel. This is what it tells us about how the children of Israel were obeying God. It says, and they gave their daughters to the Canaanite sons, and they served their gods. Okay, so this is the children of Israel. This is how they're doing at obeying God's command to not intermarry and to drive out the Canaanite tribes. Okay, so this is the average. This is the status quo. This is what society's doing. Now I want to compare that against what we just saw with Caleb. And by the way, the reason probably that the Israelites were like, well, we'll just let them assimilate and marry, and it's just easier that way. Probably because they recognized if we have to do what God told us, to not intermarry and to drive out these tribes, we're going to suffer. It's going to be difficult. But notice what Caleb does, and we just saw it. Caleb said, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. And so what we see is Caleb is different than his culture. I mean, his culture is one that's saying, it'd be easier just to go along with the status quo. It'd be easier just to let our children marry those that are here. That'd be way easier. But what Caleb says is, no. At least I am going to obey God. And so that's what we see in Caleb. Let's see what it says in the next section. Othniel, I love that name. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. By the way, it's important that we recognize this, I think. It's not saying that Othniel is Caleb's younger brother. It's saying that Kenaz is Caleb's younger brother, making Othniel Caleb's, what would it be? Nephew, right. Okay, so this is his nephew. They're related, but they're a little bit more distantly related. You'll see why that matters in my mind in the next line. So Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him in marriage. So he marries his daughter to his nephew. Not a strange thing in the ancient world. That was actually pretty common. And so Othniel, son of Kenaz, remember what the condition was. He was to attack that place, which I'm not going to try to pronounce without it on the screen because I'll do it wrong. But Caleb says, the man who attacks that location and takes it and captures it, which is obeying God, that's the one I'm going to marry to my daughter. So that's what we have here, and that man is Othniel. Now, this is chapter 1. And again, Othniel doesn't show up until chapter 3. But it tells us this in chapter 1, and I think it begins to beg the question, why is this story in chapter 1? Why do we have this as kind of the foundation for the book of Judges? And I think we're going to see it in the next few verses. Verse 14, one day when she, so this is Caleb's daughter, when she came to Othniel, she urged him to ask her father for a field. When she got off her donkey, Caleb asked her, what can I do for you? Now, this seems kind of out of left field, right? It's sort of like, what's going on here? Why are we talking about fields and asking her dad for property? Well, ultimately, I think what we see here is this is the next generation. Okay, so Othniel is going to become a very important character. And likewise, Othniel's wife is going to become a very important character who's supporting Othniel. And so the last generation, which is represented by Caleb, needs to invest in the next generation. They need to prepare them for success. And so what we see here is the daughter asking the dad, the daughter and son-in-law asking the dad for some property to help them kind of be provided for. Notice what we see in the next verse. She replied, "Do me a special favor." Okay, so she's got the land now. This is Caleb helping them out, which, by the way, when I got married to my wife, I borrowed some money from my father-in-law. So this is very personal to me. Borrowed some money from my father-in-law to buy a house. And so he provided for us. And ultimately, what's interesting about our situation is because he did that, it allowed us to be in ministry. Otherwise, I probably would have to have a normal job so that I could buy gas and drive a car. But he wanted to prepare us to do a life of ministry because that's what we wanted to do. So it's kind of similar in a way to what Caleb's doing here. So notice what she says. She says, "Do me a special favor. Since you have given me land in the Negev, give me also springs of water." So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. Now, this just seems like a story that's kind of like, why is this in here? I think, again, I want to repeat it. I think what this is doing is this is showing what Caleb does to prepare the next generation of leaders. He invests in them. He gives his own property. He even gives property with springs on it, which is really important, especially in the area of the Negev. So Caleb is preparing the next generation of leaders. He actually has a direct connection with one of the first judges that's going to show up in the book of Judges. So here's one of the things that I think really kind of connects for the crowd that's here today. Sometimes it's easy to think we're going to suffer if we invest too much in the next generation. Now, if you have adult children, I'm an adult child of a great set of parents, but there are times when they have invested in me and it's cost them something. There's times when my in-laws have invested in us and it's cost them something. And there's a lot of parents of adult children or parents even of young children who could easily say, you know what, enough's enough. You know, I'm not going to continue to enable or whatever, and that's probably good. But at the same time, what we see with Caleb is he wanted to prepare Othniel, this next generation of leader. And so he was not, it seems, concerned about losing some of his property because he could see down the line what was important. So Caleb ensured his daughter marry a leader, and Caleb invested his own resources in them, not just the leader, but them both. He invested his own, probably time too. I mean, it seems like they still have a relationship because they're asking each other for things. And notice this, Caleb maintained a relationship with him. I guess I jumped the gun there. They maintained a relationship. Now, for us today, many of us, like we said, have adult children. This is such an important thing for us to see. In preparing the next generation of leaders, what Caleb did is he didn't just sort of sever the relationship and say, enough's enough, you need to move out, you need to be on your own, you need to make your own money. He stayed connected. Now, I can't say for sure what the particulars should be in every situation, but Caleb continued to invest. And I think what we see in chapter 3 is going to show why that's so important. So let's jump to chapter 3. This is verse 7. I'll give you a second to get there. And so what you'll remember last week is chapter 1 and 2 talk a lot about this cycle of sin and then the people crying out to God. And that's kind of the foundation for Judges. Now we're going to get into the specifics. We're going to get into the specific judges that the book begins to tell us about. And we're going to meet one that's pretty familiar. So here's what verse 7 tells us in chapter 3. It says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Now, just so that we're not confused here, serving the Baals and the Asherahs was a really dirty business. It involved all kinds of sin. It's not just that God's jealous, which He is. It's not just that He's jealous, but God wants good for those who worship Him. And I think probably even in our own lives, we've seen this demonstrated. Worshiping God and not others is good for the worshiper, not just the one being worshipped. And so God does not want the children of Israel to follow the Baals and the Asherahs because the practices and the rituals that come along with that are dirty. They're filthy. They're awful. They're promiscuous. They bring disease and all kinds of trouble. So God wants them to stay pure and to continue to worship Him. But that's not what Israel does. And it's not just here, but over and over and over, Israel falls away and begins to chase these foreign gods. Notice what it says in verse 8. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that He sold them into the hands of Cushan-Reathaim, king of the Aram Naharaim. Whew, that's a mouthful. Maybe we should say it together. Let me try that again. That was kind of fun. He sold, so this is God, and what it tells us is He sells Israel into the hands of this person, Cushan-Reathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. Okay, so now, if you're an Israelite at this time, okay, and this king with a really long name shows up and he begins to oppress you, it would be easy for you to think God's abandoned us. Okay, it'd be easy for you to think when you fall into trouble, even in your own life, to think that same thing. God's abandoned me. When you fall into suffering, it's easy to think that God has forgotten me. But what this says is really important. It says that it's God that sold Israel into His hands. But by the way, God did not sell him into His hands forever. We're going to see that this is a temporary situation. And I think this brings up something that's really important for us to remember. That God's plan is not always dandelions and roses or whatever your favorite flower is. Sometimes it's the thorn. I guess it would be rose. It's sometimes the thorn. Because He has got a plan that brings us back to Him. So in this situation, God engineers this situation that's going to bring about that outcome. Let's look at what happens. Verse 9, but when they cried out to the Lord, He raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. So what we see is the first of this cycle. We talked about it last week, that there's this cycle of the people falling into sin, and then they cry out to God. Now, the missing piece here, it'd be easy to miss this. Why is it that they cry out to God? It's not because things are good, it's because things are bad. Now, remember what the last verse told us. Last verse told us that it was God that sold the Israelites into the hands of a long-named king. And now, after 8 years of that, what do? They cry out to God. So we see the cycle. God's got a plan. He is not abandoning them. He's putting them through the gauntlet so that they will turn back to Him. My brother was in, this relates, I promise. My brother was in football when he was young. He was a small guy, but he was really fast. And so he was a really good addition to the practice team for the football. And so he tried hard, he worked at it. Even though he knew he was never going to be a never going to be a starter on the team, one of the things that he noticed is that it's good as long as the coach is still yelling at you. What you don't want is the coach to stop yelling at you. Because if the coach stops yelling at you, it probably means he's given up on you. He's done with you. If you're so bad and the coach is not saying, come on, whatever, and shouting at you, it's probably because he's just abandoned the idea of ever using you. And what my brother said is that there was kind of this fine line of, as long as the coach is yelling at me, I know I'm still in the game. Even though I might not be a starter, I know I'm still going to be used, at least on the practice team and stuff like that. And I think it's kind of similar with the Israelites and God. And I think we could even relate it to ourselves today. It'd be easy for the Israelites to say God's abandoned us, but in a sense, this is God as a coach kind of shouting at them and saying, hey, I need to get your attention because I've got a plan for you, and I've got to turn you around, and it's going to hurt. It's going to be 2-a-days for a little while until we turn this team around. That's as good as I can do at sports analogies. I'm not real great at sports analogies. Matt, did I do okay? Was that? Yeah. He's more into football than I am. I asked Matt, we share office space. I ask Matt for sports advice pretty often because I'm out of the loop. Anyway, so that's my sports analogy for the day. I feel like it went okay. Let's move on before I mess it up. Verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came on him. Okay, so we're talking about Othniel. Okay, so remember, Othniel is the nephew, is married to I got it messed up. Othniel is the nephew of Caleb, married to Caleb's daughter, which means, I guess, that he's both his nephew and his son-in-law. I hadn't thought about that. That's kind of interesting. So anyway, he's related to Caleb in more ways than one. And so now we're talking about Othniel, okay? So we're assuming that at this point, Caleb is out of the picture, okay? The old guard, the old leadership they've passed away by this point. This is the next generation. This is what comes later. Now, just remember that Caleb has invested in the relationship of his son-in-law and his daughter. How did he do that? Well, he ensured that his daughter marry a leader, and he ensured that he invested even his own resources and time in this next generation of leaders. So let's see what happens here. It says, the Spirit of the Lord came on him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Reathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. Boy, that's a mouthful. So what we have here is Othniel living up to probably the expectations of his father-in-law, his uncle, Caleb. Caleb invests in him, and what we see is then Othniel living up to those expectations. Now, not right away, this is probably much later, but Othniel becomes a war leader, which is exactly what Israel needs at this time. They need, as they call out to God, God then gives them a judge to lead them out of this painful situation and the suffering. So, sometimes it'd be easiest for us to think we'll suffer if we invest in the next generation. We already saw that, but notice what we see here. It's those whom the previous generation invests in that will lead the next. So those kids out there, and maybe the kids in the back of our building, the kids that we come in contact with, the ones that are being invested in by our generation, by adults and even grandparents, parents, or uncles, aunts, father-in-laws, mother-in-laws, it's the ones that are going to get invested in that are going to lead the next generation. The ones that get ignored, God could do something in their life. It'll probably be someone else that invests in them. And so if you are interested in playing a part in preparing the next generation, you don't have to focus on thousands of people. You got to focus on those small numbers of people that you have influence with. Maybe that's your kids. Maybe it's your extended family. But those are the ones that we need to be investing in because those are the ones that are going to lead in the next generation as it comes. Verse 11, so the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Okay, so there's a good outcome here. Now just think about Caleb's investment here. By this time, Caleb's long gone. But Caleb invests a little bit. Probably didn't even cost him that much, but he invests a little bit in his son-in-law, nephew, Othniel, and what it buys for Israel is 40 years of peace and enjoyment. Pretty good investment when we think about it in those terms. Now, what I want you to notice is kind of a formula that we actually see a number of times in Judges. So the Israelites were subject to that king with the long name for 8 years, but notice what happens when they finally call out to God. The land has peace for 40 years. That's a pretty good multiplication. They're under suffering for a short time, and then their enjoyment and their peace lasts quite a while. Now, this is not the last time we're going to see this same formula in Judges. So Caleb's investment in the next generation bought 40 years of peace and freedom. Pretty good turnaround on his investment. Let's pray.